Alright, so next up we're going to be taking a look at chapter 3 of the textbook, and I will help you understand what is it that you need to know at the end of this chapter. Chapter 3 introduces the principle of individualism through the case study of the Industrial Revolution by looking at the growth of capitalism. At the end of this chapter, chapter 3, I'd like you to be able to understand more about individualism, mostly from an economic perspective. I would expect that by the end of this chapter you understand who Adam Smith is, that you understand what laissez-faire capitalism is, what are some of the assumptions about the role of citizens and the role of government in a laissez-faire or laissez-faire system. I want you to understand the Industrial Revolution and how it could be seen as a time of great growth and prosperity and progress and innovation, but also a time of some social and economic and political inequality. So I'd like you to be able to explore through this chapter how there might be some who celebrate the Industrial Revolution and capitalism and therefore classic economic liberalism, but some who would challenge it. And that will be our segue into the next chapter. So early on in this chapter, there's a series of quotes from individuals like Charles Dickens to try to give us some frame of reference to really ground us in the time of the Industrial Revolution. So, for example, Charles Dickens is quoted by saying, "Every day was the same as yesterday." So that's the mundane existence that began to be an associated part of liberalism. This idea that our jobs became so specialized that they did become quite mundane, quite robotic. And he also provides a solution that Charles Dickens says we must rally around one another as one united power to crumble into dust the oppressors. So it kind of sounds like he values collectivism, right? That he values cooperation over competition, collective interest over self-interest. He also exposes child labor, where he talks about the demands that they share our sorrows before they're capable of entering into our enjoyments. So one of the flaws early on exposed of liberalism is the exploitive nature that we ended up seeing in grade 10 with globalization. David Ricardo, though, does at the bottom of page 103, he does kind of rebut Charles Dickens and critics of classic economic liberalism by saying that the market and the value of labor within it, labor is a commodity much like anything else, and the value of labor, the value of me as a worker, will increase when what I can provide is scarce. So if there's many people that can do what I do, then I need to find either a different niche or become better at doing what I do. So David Ricardo talks about this iron law of wages that really talks about the relationship between supply and demand and how it can shape, how much value people see in us. This chapter gives us an opportunity to look more at some of those principles of individualism we saw in chapter 2, things like self-interest and economic freedom that end up being the building blocks of classic economic liberalism, as to is competition. Friedrich Hayek, although not from the classic era, is quoted to try to further that perspective of individualism that is being outlined in the beginning of chapter 3. He says there can be no freedom of press if the instruments of printing are under government control. No freedom of assembly if the needed rooms are so controlled. No freedom of movement if the means of transport are a government monopoly. So Hayek, in terms of this struggle between individualism and collectivism, Hayek is weighing in on the side of individualism, suggesting that where we have government, we lose freedom. So what is classic liberalism? It was a paradigm shift away from collectivism. We had a feudal order before the Renaissance, a feudal order that was very static. And your identity wasn't so much individual, is more of identify with the village that my ancestors grew up in and my descendants will also live and die in as well. So this Renaissance was a paradigm shift away from collectivism, away from this idea of collective interest, common good, public property, the common lands, towards private property. Let's put a fence around the common lands and sell it off in parcels to individual people and deny access to those who do not own it. This chapter also goes back to John Locke and reintroduces the idea that why men enter into society must be the preservation of our freedom, preservation of our property, and therefore the government has a responsibility to the will of the people to protect our interests. Therefore, Locke is opposed to authoritarianism, whereas Hobbes, we know he sees a need for authoritarianism because he suggests that humans are inherently selfish, and because we're selfish, we'll prey on each other, and it's only through our obedience to the state that our life can be worth living and we can have an opportunity to do more than just survive. Montesquieu is also introduced in our cast of characters in chapter 3. He talks about the need for checks and balances. Living in an age of absolutism, they had no checks and balances. The king had the ability to not only create the law, but also administer the law and interpret the legality of the law. Today in the United States, they have a system of checks and balances. You have a legislative branch that creates the laws, but they do not enforce the laws. The executive branch enforces the laws. And finally, the judicial branch, they study the law, they look at the legality of it, the constitutionality of it. So similar concepts you saw in grade 9 social studies, checks and balances. Baron de Montesquieu is introduced in this chapter as well. So cast of characters is growing. Jon Stewart Mill is introduced in this chapter, and his primary idea is this harm principle, that your freedom should be nearly absolute. The only thing limiting your freedom is when your freedom hurts or harms someone else. So a recurring theme this year will be, at what point do we reasonably limit freedoms? When is it reasonable to censor? When is it reasonable to force people into quarantine, to wear masks, to isolate? Under what conditions? Whether they be historic, contemporary, or hypothetical, under what conditions would warrant government restricting our natural rights and freedoms? The textbook talks a little bit about the Industrial Revolution coming to England. Again, the Industrial Revolution is economic individualism because laissez-faire capitalism will really shape it, and it'll be shaped by those drivers of individualism like self-interest, competition, private property, economic freedom. The Industrial Revolution comes to England first because it has natural resources that would be the building blocks of the Industrial Revolution, things like coal. It has some other geographic advantages. It's an island. It has a powerful navy that will be a shipping fleet. It has some rivers that can be used to transport goods and services, mostly goods. And the rivers can also be used for a source of power. The people there had been influenced by the writings of the Renaissance, the Enlightenment, and therefore they were ready for a paradigm shift economically towards something based upon innovation. They had an empire that would provide them resources and provide them consumers to sell their mass-produced products to. Textbook also goes back to to Social 20 and the concept of the case study of the French Revolution. And within the French Revolution, we also see a paradigm shift towards individualism. It's right there in the slogan, right? Liberty, equality, fraternity. Well, the liberty part sure sounds like individualism. The equality part sure sounds like collectivism. So it is a paradigm shift away from the ancient regime, the old order, and parts of it will be celebrating individualism, like what we see in the Declaration of the Rights of Man and Citizen, where some things like the freedom of speech and religious freedoms are promoted. So when you look at the Declaration of Rights of Man, it says things like men are born and remain free and equal in rights. The aim of all political association is the preservation of the natural rights. This sounds a lot like John Locke. This sounds a lot like liberalism. We also have the American Revolution here as a quick case study. Definitely there's an opportunity to learn more about individuals like Paine and Franklin and Jefferson there. The textbook doesn't do a great job with it, so there's more detail in my notes as well. But the Industrial Revolution is the key part of this chapter. And I like the quote that the textbook has. The Industrial Revolution was the most far-reaching, influential transformation of human culture since the advent of agriculture 8 or 10,000 years ago. The consequences of this revolution would change irrevocably human labor, consumption, family structure, social structure, and even the very soul and thoughts of the individual. So this quote is from 1996 from a man called Richard Hooker, and I talk about this in Social 10 as well. And I think this quote from Richard Hooker really talks about the significance of the Industrial Revolution. Why is it significant? Well, it changes us irrevocably, right? It changes our consumption, our family structure, our social structure. It changes our soul. It changes our very thoughts as individuals. So it's more than just an economic revolution. It is the time of most change in our history of the last 8 to 10,000 years. So great wealth will be created. So one way to measure the economic individualism is to show, in a chart, this is how much growth, how much wealth is being created. But at the same time, there's poverty that is being created as well. That the gap between the rich and poor is growing. And with urbanization, there will be new problems like the outbreak of cholera that they didn't experience on the farm. So it talks a little bit about the beginning of capitalism. What is a capitalist? A capitalist is someone who has capital. What is capital? It's an asset that is used to grow money. Capital at this time would be machines. Not everybody can afford these new machines. So you will have the concentration of ownership of machines in the hands of the few. And because machines will be able to produce mass wealth, then those few people will become wealthy. Who are they? They are the newly rich, the nouveau riche. The nouveau riche will be called robber barons by critics, but these are those new nobles within society. They're not nobles of the battlefield. They're not nobles of law. They haven't earned their title or been given their title by government. They earn it by economics, by commerce, right? The nouveau riche. And the power of the nouveau riche will challenge the power of the nobles of past. And so there will be a social conflict between the new rich, the capitalists, and the old rich, the land barons, the people that had been in power during the age of feudalism. The textbook also introduces concepts like the changing role of women within society in the Industrial Revolution. We're going to come back to the role of women in a future chapter when we study things politically and socially. So the purpose of Chapter 3 is really to outline the Industrial Revolution. Within Chapter 3, you should know more about Adam Smith, his idea of the invisible hand, the idea of greed, the idea of self-interest. You should understand, what is capitalism? What is laissez-faire capitalism? And why might people like it? And why might people be challenged by it? Why might people be upset by it? Definitely, the textbook Chapter 3 introduces it. It doesn't do a great job. It really doesn't. So that's why I've created the online lesson to provide you more information and my online lecture that talks you through it.